Welcome to the second video looking at the Mrs. Williams case study. We've just finished discussing the fact that the hospital staff are a little unclear on whether or not Michael does have a power of attorney, or depending on which jurisdiction in the country we're thinking about, a document which appoints somebody else to make both health, and in this case they also asked for financial questions. We don't have any evidence that they've seen any such documents, and we have noticed that later in the case study Michael is executing a document, and again we don't know whether or not that's a replacement or whether it's in fact the document in question, i.e. maybe he doesn't have one whatsoever but is quickly trying to get one. We're uncertain about this. We've discussed the fact that the doctor is somewhat unclear as to what authority that he is asking Michael to make the decision on, though we don't know whether or not he got consent from the mom, and we don't know on what basis he's asked Michael to make the decision. And we also know that she has a history of urinary tract infections and blood sugar issues, both of which can affect capacity. We found out that the doctor has now done an MMSE in Mary and determined that her low score meant that she has cognitive impairment. A low score does not mean that she has cognitive impairment in terms of a lack of legal capacity. It means that she got a low score on the MMSE. It's indicative of a concern for cognitive impairment. So it's a bit of a conflation of those two things. It's important to understand that it's probably quite inappropriate for the doctor to be making any kind of sweeping statements about her cognitive state post-surgery. So we know that there will be challenges post-surgery, there may be delirium, there may be other challenges with her blood sugar and so forth. So there's nothing wrong with him doing some tests to get an understanding on a snapshot basis, but it shouldn't be used as any kind of longer term issue. We don't know much about Mary except the fact that she's been labeled to live quite independently, and there's no history of cognitive impairment despite blood sugar or urinary tract questions that she may have episodically. So to have a determination kind of wholesale that she doesn't have capacity is quite inappropriate in this case. We're seeing that the high school buddy George has been called up and he goes into the hospital room. Now, many of you may have questions about the appropriateness of George attending the hospital. There's nothing wrong with George as the lawyer attending in the hospital. There is, however, something wrong with George doing it with Michael's presence there. Michael doesn't leave the room, and George has an obligation, pursuant to his professional duties, to meet individually with Mary. He also must himself determine whether she understands and appreciates what she's doing. In this case, you'll see that Mary answers him quite sharply and reminds him that she doesn't need to be talked to like she's an idiot, and that she reminds him also that she knew him in diapers. None of which, of course, answer the question about whether or not she understands and appreciates that she's making substitute decision-making documents. Now, can she do it legally if there's already been a determination of lack of capacity pursuant to an MMSE? Yes, it's actually George as the lawyer who has the obligation to understand that he has to determine her legal capacity. So he has to ask very careful questions and ensure himself that she understands and appreciates. Capacity is decisional. So even if she wasn't able to decide something pursuant to a healthcare decision, she may still be able to make the decision to appoint somebody else to be a substitute decision maker. So one thing is not determinative of the other. Having said that, it may raise questions, and George would want to be very careful in his asking of questions, his writing down of his notes and so forth. But just because there's an MMSE that says she's got cognitive impairment and isn't capable does not mean that George can't execute the documents on her behalf. It does raise questions on both ends, however. We see that Mary keeps looking at Michael worriedly throughout. First of all, Michael shouldn't be in the room when the documents are being executed. Second of all, it's unclear who is witnessing these documents because Michael can't witness the documents if he's the person being used. Now, the lawyer, depending on the situation, may have brought somebody in, but it's a little unclear how these documents are being executed. The cue about Mary looking worriedly at Michael throughout may raise hackles around a number of different questions, including abuse and neglect. She may feel that she's under undue influence. She may not know what's going on. She may be confused more broadly as to why he's there or what's happening. But it's certainly a cue to us to ask more questions. We see Susan showing up demanding to see her mother, and she starts telling hospital staff that she's there to sort things out before her useless brother makes his usual mess of things. Now, that doesn't cue us one way or the other, but we do know that Michael's had a drinking problem, but just because he's had a drinking problem doesn't mean that he's in any way abusive, and we don't know whether Susan has any authority whatsoever. The doctor comes back several days later and again decides that Mary is incapable based on his discussion with her. So he's now done an MMSE several days ago post-op and has now determined that 3 days after the surgery that she's incapable. Again, 3 days is not a lot of time and certainly not something I would want to make a formal determination of. But we have a bit more time to consider it. Still, it's a little bit dodgy. And incapable of what? We don't know. So is he trying to say that she's completely globally and incapable of making all health and personal care decisions and all financial decisions? It's unclear. The doctor does need to, in his notes, make clear as to what type of decisions he thinks that Mary is incapable of making. So it's inappropriate for him to say that she's just incapable. We see that Mary is also quite concerned about what's happening to her, and we're going to need to find out from her what her wishes are. At no point do I see anyone checking in with Mary around what she wants. We see as well that the doctor writes up a report, and that report somehow is going to have some kind of implication. Now, the report itself is done after the execution of the documents, but if it's well done, it may cast suspicion onto the execution of the personal care documents and the financial power of attorney documents. So we have a little bit of a lack of clarity around the impact of such a report. But Michael goes to the bank to, quote, move some money around. Often there are hospital expenses or other expenses to be taken care of. It's not inappropriate that he would do that. He would do that presumably pursuant to his power of attorney for financial affairs. At this point, again, it's a little unclear. Is there going to be an abusive situation financially? What impact does the determination pursuant to the doctor have, because he's moving money around after it's been determined? Now, it is important that when you execute a document like a will or a power of attorney, you only have to be able to understand and appreciate at the time of the instructions and at the time of the execution. So whether or not the doctor is doing his determination such as it was before the execution of the documents and after the execution of the documents, just because of that does not mean she's not incapable of executing the documents at the time. So that itself is not determinative. What we see here is a bit of a conflation of timelines, a lack of clarity around power and control dynamics, a lack of clarity around the authority that people have. Having said that, this is a very common situation. Using the counterpoint charting tool would allow us to be able to chart at different times along the way and raise some of the key questions that we have so that we don't have a disconnect amongst hospital staff, nurses, doctors, etc.